I now invite Rainer Schulze. Like I said, he's a professor emeritus in modern European history of University of Essex and founding editor of the Journal of Holocaust in History and Memory, and he will talk about 20 minutes to us on crimes against humanity. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you. Oh, did I do something wrong? Well, I put my thingy on the computer and the image. So if there's a technical problem, please let me know. I'll try to, because there's no lectern, and as a long-time professor, I'm used to lecterns. Right, so I'll start again. Good morning, and thank you for asking me to speak here. It's a great honor and a great pleasure to speak at the opening of this important conference, but as was already indicated, I'm a historian, not a lawyer, and I'm mainly a historian of the Holocaust. So in the face of all the expertise here in this room on the Rohingya case, I feel kind of humbled. I was asked to talk a little bit about the wider context and about the Holocaust as a possible focus of the Genocide Convention, and that's what I will do. And I will start by reminding you that, of course, today's conference takes place at a historically very significant location, the German capital Berlin, which of course was also the capital of Nazi Germany. It was about 25 kilometers southwest of here, in a villa on the Wannsee, that the final solution of the Jewish question and its implementation were discussed and agreed upon on the 20th of January 1942. It was about 3 kilometers northwest of here, in a villa on the edge of the Tiergarten, that the murder of the disabled people, the so-called euthanasia killing, was organized and coordinated from early 1940. It was about 12 kilometers northeast from here that the so-called Rastplatz, or resting place, Marzahn, was set up in 1936, the fenced-in camp where Berlin's Sinti and Roma population were forced by the authorities to relocate to, and this was one of the first visible steps towards the Roma genocide. And it was about 4 kilometers west of here that in early 1933, the new Nazi German authorities started their crackdown on the German LGBTIQ community by closing down all their bars and other meeting places, thus forcing gay men, lesbians, transgender people to go underground. I could go on and on and on, but I think it's already pretty clear. Berlin is a city where genocide, extermination, and mass murder were organized and orchestrated. And it was a wide range of populations that were targeted at different times of the Nazi regime, and the methods used, the ways of persecution were different from group to group, but the overall aim was the same: to create a homogeneous society, or Volksgemeinschaft as the Nazis called it, and all who were regarded as different, as not belonging to or worthy of belonging to this Volksgemeinschaft, were to be eliminated in one way or the other. The memory of this past is constantly present here in Berlin. It is a past that does not go away, and I would add that should and must not go away. Today, there are numerous memorials which remind us of these unimaginable atrocities that did not only take place here in Germany, but all across German-occupied Europe. Even the building opposite the street, the Annex to the Jewish Museum, is such a memorial, designed in a new deconstructivist style by Daniel Libeskind, who wanted to express with his design German Jewish history and the rupture of this history by the Shoah. And please note that I use Shoah for the Jewish persecution and Holocaust for the persecutions by the Nazis, more generally targeting all different kinds of populations. When walking through Berlin, one cannot avoid being constantly reminded of the total breakdown of civilization that the German Nazi state brought about in Germany and in Europe and beyond. You have to close your eyes not to notice it. But the constant reminder of the past, not only here in Berlin, but across Germany, is of course pretty meaningless if it does not go together with the ability and the willingness to learn from this history and apply it to the present, which means spotting similar chains of events evolving no matter where in the world, and having the political will to intervene and put a stop to any such developments. And one could, of course, argue, and many do, that Germany, with its history, its particular Nazi history, has a duty, more than other countries, a duty to be vigilant and be at the forefront of the battle against genocide and the causes of genocide. But before I talk about Germany, let me briefly look at the wider picture. After the end of the war, after the liberation of Europe, there were numerous war crimes trials against prominent members of the political, military, economic, judicial, and medical leadership of Nazi Germany, and they were actually a milestone in the development of international law, especially the International Military Tribunal held in Nuremberg. The so-called Nuremberg trial paved the way for a specific international jurisprudence in matters of war crimes, crimes against humanity, wars of aggression, as well as for the creation of the International Criminal Court. Crimes against humanity, which was one of the offenses used by the Nuremberg trial in their prosecution, comes closest to the concept of genocide. It was defined as, and I quote, murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and other inhumane acts committed against any civilian populations before or during the war, or persecutions on racial, political, or religious grounds. End of quote. The Holocaust persuaded the international community that these kinds of crimes had to be addressed on an international level, and that it required agreement between the international community if the new world order was to be strictly guided by the rule of law after the Nazis' breach of all rules of civilization and their acts of barbarism. And this belief led, of course, as was already mentioned, to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted on the 10th of December 1948, and one day earlier, the Convention on the Prevention of and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, or short Genocide Convention, which was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly on the 9th of December 1948. It is easy, all too easy, to regard the Genocide Convention as the world's determined response to the Holocaust. But this assumption is wrong. Whilst the Holocaust had no doubt some impact on giving the adoption of the Genocide Convention more urgency, reducing the Genocide Convention to the Holocaust would miss two central points. A, the protracted evolution of the convention, which started long before the Holocaust, and B, the fact that the Genocide Convention was not intended to be about one specific genocide, but it was meant to address all genocides, no matter when and where they occurred. The atrocities uncovered by the Allied armies as they liberated Europe from Nazi rule accelerated the discussions about a Genocide Convention, and it increased the readiness and willingness of the international community to pass and subsequently ratify the convention. But they were not the starting point of the discussion about this convention. Instead, the Genocide Convention is the culmination of years of campaigning, spearheaded by the Polish Jewish lawyer Raphael Lemkin, who was already mentioned, who devised the term genocide and who campaigned vigorously to make the crime of genocide punishable under international law. From very early in his professional career, Lemkin had developed an interest in how the law dealt with mass killings of a kind that he initially called barbarity or acts of barbarism, for a lack of a better term. The massacre of the Armenians committed under the Ottomans, anti-Semitic pogroms in Eastern Europe and Russia, the experience of Assyrians who were murdered in Iraq during the 1933 Simele massacre, and similar acts of violence directed against a specific ethnic, religious, or otherwise defined group. These atrocities formed his belief that not only individuals, but also groups needed legal protection from organized violence directed against them as a group. In 1933, Lemkin made a presentation to the Legal Council of the League of Nations at a conference in Madrid, proposing to outlaw, as he still called it, acts of barbarism and vandalism as a crime against international law. And this was the first time that he developed the concept of the crime, which he later, and that was also mentioned in his 1943-44 publication, gave the term genocide. Lemkin was disappointed about how the judges at the Nuremberg trial interpreted crimes against humanity. He felt they used an approach that was too narrow and thus downgraded the genocidal dimensions as he had developed them. And he lobbied amongst national delegations to the UN General Assembly for a convention that would support his position of a wider view of genocide. So it is important to remember that the Genocide Convention as an intellectual and legal concept has a much broader basis than the Holocaust. In other words, it means that the Holocaust and the plight of the Jewish people during the Nazi rule over much of Europe does not constitute a gold standard which has to be fulfilled for a series of events to qualify as genocide. Article 2 of the Genocide Convention defines genocide in legal terms completely independent of the Holocaust. Genocide is any act committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. In the run-up to today's conference, there was a lively email exchange amongst participants about some shortcomings of this legal definition, some flaws of the Genocide Convention. And let me just give my historian's view on some of the points raised. The Genocide Convention puts the intention of the perpetrator at its heart. It defines genocide as an act or a series of acts committed with the intent to destroy. And there is criticism that the Genocide Convention focuses on the intention of the perpetrator. I firmly believe that this is the right approach, that the perpetrator or perpetrators belong into the dock, if only to reverse the previous power structure where the perpetrator was the acting power. The survivors and witnesses have an important task and a central role in any criminal proceedings. Their role is to provide their testimony. And this is a powerful role. If you remember the Nuremberg trials, you don't necessarily remember the defendants in the dock. You remember the powerful statements and testimonies of the survivors. And you also remember the evidence used in court, which was, at that time, 1946, revolutionary film material from the liberated camps, which brought home powerfully of what happened. It was not just about reaching a verdict against the perpetrators. Its much more important role in the longer term was to document and to verify the events that took place. And that is the important role of, as I see it as a historian, of the survivors and witnesses of genocide and other atrocities to provide this testimony, and this puts the experience of the victims always at the heart of any of these legal proceedings. Therefore, the Genocide Convention's focus on the perpetrators is, in my view, actually its strength and not necessarily a flaw, and yet for another reason. It means that under the convention, the following crimes can be punished, and I just quote from the convention: genocide, which is the actual killings; conspiracy to commit genocide; direct and public incitement to commit genocide; attempt to commit genocide; and complicity in genocide. And this list from the convention shows that there are many acts which constitute crimes under the Genocide Convention which do not involve killings. Indeed, only one prohibited act stated in the convention is killing. And it does not require a particular scale. This is, I believe, still today a major source of both popular and general, possibly even scholarly misapprehension, because many seem to think that genocide means or requires a lot of killing, like in the case of the Jewish Holocaust, where the numbers are, of course, staggering. But it also shows that the Holocaust is not the gold standard as to what constitutes genocide, because the scale of the killing is not important. It is the intent to destroy a population as a whole or in part. Further criticism includes that the Genocide Convention only specifically includes national, ethnical, racial, and religious groups, omitting to include social and political groups as targets of genocide. And that is indeed a shortcoming. The first draft of the Genocide Convention had still included such a provision, but it was dropped because the Soviet Union, along with some other states, did not accept that actions taken against groups with similar political views or of similar social status or class constituted genocide. Also, the Genocide Convention restricts the definition of genocide to physical acts, whereas Lemkin and others would have liked to see non-physical acts, in particular psychological acts, included as well. So the Genocide Convention is, of course, a compromise, but this fact does not diminish its importance or its relevance or makes it useless. The Genocide Convention has no doubt flaws and some shortcomings, and it does not include everything that Lemkin and others, and some of us today, had hoped and campaigned for, but it is a legal framework that by now has been ratified by some 150 states. This means it forms a standard which the international community has agreed on, and it is a standard that at least theoretically binds all state and non-state actors who have been put on notice that these kinds of atrocities are no longer considered internal or domestic matters, which they can handle as they please, but that compliance with these standards is enforceable by the international will. It puts all actors on notice that they cannot act with impunity. And even if it's not always enforced, and in many cases was not enforced, which is deplorable, at least the standard, the framework is there, which I think is something really important. It is not to be underestimated. And I would even go so far and say that without the Genocide Convention and a general awareness that this convention produced of the crime of genocide, the dimension and the character of the persecution of the Rohingyas might have well gone largely unnoticed, similar to how the Armenian genocide was appreciated, or rather ignored, for such a long time, so that Hitler could say in 1939, shortly before the invasion of Poland, who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians? I'm a historian, and as a historian, I would strongly argue that the flaws or shortcomings of the Genocide Convention are not so much the legal definitions or the actual clauses of the convention, but the unwillingness of the international community to enforce the convention as it stands. All too often, there's a lack of political will to stand up, speak out, and act, which is, of course, deplorable, and we need to campaign that this changes. However, this unwillingness to act says more about the state of international politics than any inadequacy of the convention. Law, justice, and political power are, of course, interrelated, but this relationship is a complex one, and it doesn't mean that it is always political power which dictates the law. And if we only need one indication, it is the fact that dictatorships suppress the legal system. Let me just add, the Genocide Convention puts a high barrier on crimes to qualify as genocide. And I would argue that this is actually correct. Genocide is the most evil, or whichever term you want to use, atrocity that a group of population can suffer. And we should not use the term genocide lightly or widely or too broadly, because then it loses its power. We need to be rigorous in our terminology. Not every human rights violation is a genocide. Not every ethnic cleansing is a genocide. Not every forced resettlement is a genocide. And we need to be clear about it. But we need to be equally clear that the term genocide must be used when it is appropriate. And the Genocide Convention gives us very clear indication of when we should use the term genocide. And in the case of the Rohingyas, it is obvious to everyone, I would argue, that this term is appropriate and must be used, and we can very much delineate it from the Genocide Convention. But we have to be clear and rigorous in the terminology that we use. One final comment. The Genocide Convention also calls for the prevention of genocide, and here its impact has been deplorably limited. The Rohingya case is just one of the many examples. And this will remain a serious challenge for the future, and it will need many more conferences such as these to alert the international community, to alert the political actors, to alert the wider audience that the Genocide Convention is not just a document that is archived in some worthy archives, but it is an active and living document that guides us, that gives us indication as how we should act politically. And this brings me back to Germany and Berlin, the place where we meet today. Berlin has a multitude of memorials commemorating those who were killed during the Nazi regime. But does this help to prevent new genocide from happening? And again, I have to ask everyone to be more rigorous in their terminology. We speak of the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, but there is no such thing. There is a memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe. There is a memorial, another one, to the persecuted Sinti and Roma of Europe. There is yet another memorial to the persecuted homosexuals. And there is yet another memorial to those killed in the the so-called euthanasia program, the T4 action. This already shows one of the problems. We separate victims according to their victim group. We don't see, or this holds the danger, that we do not see the overall structural aim, which is homogenization of society. By separating the victims and by inadvertently calling the monument to the murdered Jews the Holocaust Memorial, we ultimately falsify history and omit groups that were persecuted as well. And the Roma case is a very sad one. It took until the 1980s before the German government actually accepted that it was a genocide that the Roma suffered. It took that many years before any form of compensation or recognition as victims of Nazi persecution was actually officially achieved. And this is because we have a hierarchization of victims. And this is what we must avoid. We must not compare the persecutions, but we must, in a sense, see the structural similarities between them, which is a homogenization of society. And if we do that, then learning from history makes actually sense. If we don't do that, it means that we put history into the past and firmly shut the door. We know perhaps more than enough about the persecution of the Jews, but we don't necessarily apply the structures of the persecution to what we see in the world around us. So genocide prevention is not only acting or intervening when the first signs of genocides are already visible. Genocide prevention has to start much earlier, everywhere around the world, in the families, in the local communities, in the schools. Diversity and inclusivity have to become as firmly embedded in the education curricula everywhere in the world, as firmly embedded as spelling and arithmetic. This is how we can slowly, over many generations, try to change people's mindset in order to appreciate that diversity and inclusivity is not something that is threatening, but that it is something that is enriching. And of course, the German example can also make this clear. The Holocaust, the Shoah, now more specifically, has actually led to terrible gaps in German culture. It has taken away vital and important elements from German culture, and every genocide does the same thing. So if the Holocaust teaches us one thing loudly and clearly, it is this: when the human rights of one group of population are violated and abolished, no one can feel safe. And here in Germany and beyond, many understand this when they look at the Nazi period. But too many fail to make this connection with today, with the world they live in. So yes, I very much support the title of a keynote address later today. Let's focus on the law, but always think about justice. But let's think about justice widely, not just as a legal process, but also as something that needs to be embedded in the educational process. And it doesn't matter whether it's Myanmar or Germany or any other state of the world. That is where we need to start at the educational level. And it means, as I said, not to compare atrocities, but to see and study and learn from the structures behind the atrocities and the overall aims. Then we can actually do what I always have as the motto, if you so want, of my teaching. We can learn about the past to understand the present and to build a future for everyone that includes everyone in a diverse and common future. Thank you very much.